Hello, welcome to World Civilizations since 1500. Now, today we're starting the fifth topic of the semester, which is titled European Colonialism, Old and New. So, in essence, what we're going to be doing in this segment is looking at what is called the rise of the West, okay? Or Europe for that matter. The ascendancy of European powers to the world stage, and they're going to be dominating different areas of the globe, uh, politically, economically, of course, militarily, but to a certain degree also culturally as well. And this is relevant because um, the rise of the West, or European civilization, taking, of course, a more prominent role in world affairs, becoming really the center of economic, political, financial, military power in the world, is going to be significant because Europeans will really disseminate many of the ideas that we explored in the fourth topic that we covered, with the age of revolutions, the revolutions that brought about the modern world. So again, the Europeans will serve as agents of modernity. They will try to spread those ideas into the areas that they're beginning to take more and more control of, extracting, of course, resources from other areas, whether is the Western Hemisphere, for example, the Americas, or Africa, or the Middle East, India, or China, for that matter. So those are the areas that we're going to be looking at. And again, in this process of expansionism, they're going to be exerting significant control of those regions, some of them more directly than others. But again, this really set off a process that historically this is called colonialism, or otherwise known also as imperialism. Okay, concepts that are really interchangeable. So European imperialism or European colonialism. And as the title suggests, if we can just go to our slide. As the title suggests, we're going to be looking at two main historical stages of European colonialism. It is undeniable, again, it is really a historical fact that since the 1500s, we're going to see the rise of Europe to world power. Again, this is not happening immediately. This is not an overnight process, but the ascendancy of Europe, or the West for that matter, again, begins around the 1500s. And Europe will continue to ascend in that way for the next few centuries, all the way to, let us just say, the early part of the 20th century, when we see, of course, Europeans competing with one another, European empires pretty much destroying each other in what became known as the World Wars, the First and the Second World Wars. Again, really, that marked the end of European imperialism to a great degree. All right, so as the table of contents show, let's just look at the table of contents here. We're going to explore European colonialism by looking at four major areas of study. Part one is going to look at the rise of European colonialism itself. I mean, and we have to a certain degree, assess the factors, the reasons why Europe and not other societies are ascending to world power. What really led to European colonialism, that is to say, as opposed to, let us just say, Chinese or African or Middle Eastern, for example, and so on. This is what we're going to be doing in the first part of this session. Part two is going to now look at European colonialism itself, and this is something that occurred at the very outset, let us just say from 1500 to give and take 1750. This became known as the old colonialism. When we study, for example, European history, even in world history for that matter. Again, this is the old European colonialism, and the kind of empires that flourished, as we're going to see, were plantation empires. Again, this is how those empires were able to flourish. Again, so this is something we're going to also assess quite thoroughly in this session. Part three, something that we're going to look very extensively in the next session, session two, is the new colonialism. This is something that emerges around 1750 with the rise of the Industrial Revolution that is taking place in Britain, and it is really spreading into other areas of Europe, that led to the rise of new kinds of empires that sustain their economies and their militaries, and of course their imperial control through industrial production. Okay, so again, this is a new type of colonialism that will be more direct in terms of ruling different societies, whether we're talking about Africa, for example, or India, more directly. Okay, and the Europeans are moving more forcefully, in other words, because of new technologies, of course, at their disposal. They're going to be moving more decisively to rule other societies more directly. Again, something that we're going to see. And of course, we're going to look at different areas of the globe in which they were colonizing. I just mentioned, for example, Africa, India. We're also going to look at Southeast Asia. We are also going to be looking at areas of the Middle East and China. Okay. Part four, at the very end, and this is something that we're going to look in session three, is we're going to see some of the responses of the indigenous societies that were colonized by the European powers, how they were responding, reacting to the imposition, again, of foreign control. Again, this is what is called anti-colonial resistance movements. Again, there will be a series of case studies. Again, we're going to really look at different areas of the globe, particularly the Western Hemisphere. We're going to see, of course, indigenous leaders rising up, mobilizing people to combat, again, European powers. Something we're also going to see in parts of Africa as well, and also in China. Okay, so again, there will be a series of case studies we're going to look at. We're going to draw comparisons as to how they were able to mobilize people, what kind of ideas they use, and whether they were successful or not. Again. All right, so let's look at part one. As I indicated, part one is going to look at the rise of European colonialism by looking at the historical contingencies, that is to say, the historical factors that came together to benefit Europeans in terms of giving them an advantage over other societies to develop technologies and began the process of expansionism and colonialism. Why is it that we're going to see Europe on the rise? And again, I will offer three main contingencies that historians that have looked at the rise of the West have assessed, have determined that those were perhaps the most important factors. Perhaps the most important one, number one, is the discovery of America. Okay, the discovery of America by Europeans. So again, this is extremely important, that the fact that Europeans will claim credit for the discovery of America and therefore claim entitlements to develop trading outposts and eventually colonies that they control for the purpose of extracting resources. The fact that the Europeans claim the credit for that and not other societies, again, this is going to give Europeans a great advantage. As I mentioned, and this is something that I've been stressing over and over again in previous topics, again, that America, the American continent in general, and all of its resources will really be an extension of Europe. Again, and they will form part of the European economy, an extension of the European economy. Now, this really was perhaps the greatest moment of luck for Europeans. Because up to, let us just say, 1492, when we see an emergent trading system, we see the global trade networks, for example, that we assessed in the past. Europeans were engaged in that trade, but they had a trade imbalance with the rest of the world because it seems that Europeans were simply importing more products from without than they were exporting it, in other words, to the network around the world. Okay. India, China had their largest economies. We mentioned that in the past, because those economies were geared for exports. They had available land and resources, labor, successful agricultural systems, and the like. So the Europeans really were junior members of the trading system, minor partners, in other words. Okay. And they wished they had something that they could offer to the rest of the world, so they will become an equal partners with the Chinese, with the Indian merchants, and so on. And they wanted to move into that direction, but the problem is the lack of land and the lack of resources, for example. Okay, they wanted to grow cash crops and so on, but Europe had its limitations, and they just didn't have the wherewithal, the land, and so on to produce it. And the discovery of America changed all of that. Again, it's almost like more land was added to Europe, all of a sudden. Of course, it is separated by 3,000 miles of ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, but that is not going to hinder economic development in Europe. As a matter of fact, it's going to spur economic development because of the gold, the silver, and the resources that the Europeans are beginning to extract. Again, so this is, a moment of luck. It's like hitting the jackpot. You won the lottery, for example. Again, this is very important. Why Europe is on the rise. Imagine if the Chinese would have discovered and colonized America as opposed to Europe. Again, history would have been very different for the past 500 years, or any other society for that matter. Okay, so this is extremely important. Now, there are other contingencies that must be assessed as well. The discovery of America is extremely important, but other contingencies center on environmental factors. In this case, for example, a 17th century climatic change that affected the entire globe. Okay? Let me explain why this climatic change is going to benefit Europe more so than other societies. Okay? Well, first and foremost, this climatic change that was termed also, again, this is happening in the 1600s. This is something that was widely reported, not only within Europe, but around the world. It really was a cooling off in the planet. It was not necessarily a cooling cycle. The Earth goes through cycles, warm cycles, cool cycles, but this was not necessarily part of that cool cycle necessarily. It was generated by a series of changes that were transpiring, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. This so-called Little Ice Age Again, this is how people actually remember the 1600s and the little ice age, because again, temperatures descended and became extremely cold and so on. This little ice age was generated now in retrospect. Again, this is what geologists and climatologists and scientists, are studying, is that this little ice age was set off by the population decrease in the Western Hemisphere, in the American continent, by the Great Dying. Okay, we talked about the pandemics, uh, smallpox, for example, okay, that decimated pretty much 90% of the Native American population in the New World. Now, what that entailed, and again, we're talking about millions of people. Remember that conservative estimates indicate that there were about 50, maybe 60 million Native Americans, and the more liberal figures go all the way to 100, perhaps even 120 million. So again, there's a 90% decrease because of the epidemics brought by the Europeans, again, like smallpox, for example. And what that meant was that as people are dying in great numbers, the Native Americans, their economic activities that were centered, for example, on farming and the slash and burn. We talked about the slash and burn practice. They will slash the forest vegetation, burn it in order to transfer the minerals onto the ground for fertilization and so on. What that meant is that this kind of practice that was really widespread, the burning of forests and fields and so on, all of that came to a halt for about a century and a half in the American continent. So we see the reforestation taking place in many parts of the American continent. And as we see the reforestation, as the forests are beginning to grow, what this led to was a cooling of the planet, because now the foliage of the forest began to absorb more and more the greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, for example, something that we actually exude when we breathe out, for example. And carbon dioxide, this greenhouse gas, is known for actually trapping heat in the planet. So as the vegetation is now absorbing the carbon dioxide, because it's overabundant in the American continent, what we see is not enough heat is being trapped. Again, this is what is called the greenhouse effect. And of course, the temperatures are descending dramatically, particularly again in the 1600s. So again, what the cooling of the planet led to therefore, it led to a global crisis, droughts and famine. Because again, when the temperatures drop, generally speaking, less water is being evaporated into the atmosphere for precipitation. So less rainfall means droughts. And with droughts, of course, we see crop failures around the world. I mean, I should emphasize this, that this is not really happening in the Western Hemisphere. This is happening globally in the 1600s. And as farmers and peasants are experiencing crop failures continuously, there's going to be famine on the rise. And there's going to be, of course, rural unrest in the countryside. People are going to be desperate for food. This led to peasant revolts in many areas of the world, like China, for example, Russia, in the Ottoman Empire, in the Middle East. What we see is really the elites of those societies continue with their tribute system, trying to extract tribute from their peasant populations, because that's how state systems function. But as peasants were unable to produce food, much less paid those taxes, this is going to lead to revolts, outright revolts. And of course, what actually ended up happening is that those political elites, whether we're talking about China, Russia, for example, used force to repress the peasant rebellion. As that compounded the problem of famine and starvation, in that more and more people were dying because of the peasant revolt and the repression as well. Okay? It seems that peasants were calling for certain tax exceptions, something that was denied once again in China and the Middle East, and Russia, for example. And the only empire that was really willing and perhaps even wise enough to create those tax exceptions for their peasants was the Mughal Empire of India. This is, again, where the rulers understood the Little Ice Age and the consequences it was having on the peasantry, but because state systems relied 100% on the products coming from peasants and the land, again, they relieve the peasants. And so we're not going to see the kind of repressive measures again in India. Europe was going through the same process. Okay. And the same process. Again, peasants were suffering from famine, starvation, crop failures. And although there were some peasant revolts, the fact is that Europe had a relief valve, so to speak, for all the steam that was building up, pressuring again within Europe. It could be relieved by simply engaging in policies of colonization. Again, sending more and more people, for example, to the New World in the pursuit of land and resources and growing the foodstuffs that were required to sustain the European populations. So this is going to accelerate the process of colonization by state systems within Europe. Oh, they had at their disposal the American continent, of course, and so this is going to really be of a great advantage, okay, for them. But the Little Ice Age is going to serve as a sort of push factor, pushing state systems to implement more rigorous, more decisive actions for colonization, that it was about survival. We need to start colonizing, in other words, more effectively, more pervasively as well. Okay. Number three, another factor that led to the rise of Europe to world power had to do with the emergence of new kinds of European states. Again, within Europe, again, we're going to see political reforms. We're going to see new kinds of state systems that were more highly centralized and far more organized as well, economically, militarily, politically, and the like. The reason for this has to do with one of the major conflicts that Europe has experienced, besides, of course, the world wars of the 20th century. Prior to that crisis, Europe experienced another crisis that pretty much engulfed almost every political entity within Europe itself. And this became known as the 30 Years' War. It had to do with a balance of power, the growing power of the Spanish Empire within Europe itself, and of course, smaller kingdoms trying to come together and trying to pretty much contain the Spanish advance, the Spanish conquest of Europe, for that matter. It also had to do with religion. Spain is Catholic, and of course, we see Protestant states pretty much trying to stop Catholicism, again, the imposition of Catholicism in Europe. So the causes are multifaceted. We don't have the time to go over that in this discussion, but needless to say, almost virtually every party, every prince, every ruler king, monarch, so on, principality, was involved. And there were numerous, uh, if you look at this conflict, there were hundreds of political entities and polities within Europe. Okay. Many kinds of state systems, different degrees and sizes and the like. Now, the end of the war is going to bring a political change in the way those state systems are going to organize themselves. And it was part of the agreement. It came again in the form of a peace treaty. It was called the Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War. Again, so what we see is the merging of small polities into new kinds of states. So what we see is the reduction of the number of states and the reorganization of those states as well. So instead of having hundreds of different state systems in Europe, we're going to have about 30 plus of them now that are new types of states in which they're going to kind of pioneer the kind of state system that will emerge with the rise of nation states, nations, in other words. This is kind of like the early origins of the nation state. Okay. They're not necessarily labeled that, but again, this is kind of leading to that kind of idea. Those are states that are going to be very powerful and far more organized than the loosely organized states of the past. For example, they're going to exert significant political and economic authority over their populations. They will be highly centralized. They have a very well organized bureaucracies, for example, that are going to rule over every province and city, town, and domain within their borders. And they're going to be commanding the entire economy of that country. Let's just call it that, okay, at this point. Okay, see economic centralization. So in this new type of state system, what we see is the formation of new institutions that will provide sustenance to those nations. Those nations, by the way, are trying to protect each other from other nations. They're trying to protect their borders. They're trying to protect incursions from other powers into their territory and the like. So they need, for example, standing armies, a permanent, again, more professional army that will be used to defend the country, okay, from foreign invaders and the like. And because there is this famine on the rise, remember in the 1600s, the Little Ice Age, those state systems do not want to overburden their populations, the peasants, in other words, trying to demand and squeeze more tribute from them, not at this point in time. This is not to say that they abandon all kinds of tribute. This is not to say that they, relieve the populations, for a long period of time. What they're trying to do is trying to come up with an alternative means of sustaining the state finances. And so what we see is the formation of state banks. Okay, those are actually merchants that have accumulated significant wealth if in trading operations overseas, accumulating gold, silver, and the like. They live in the urban centers and the big cities again, and the big cities are going to be really the centers of economic power. And those cities will see the rise of financial institutions, some of which will become the official financial institutions of the state, what we call today a national bank, something that emerges in places like Holland in the late 1600s, and also in England, like the Bank of England, for example. Those are national banks. They provide finances, loans to state systems in order to finance, for example, military campaigns and wars. Okay? So they're highly organized. They now have a reliable source of revenue that is coming, of course, from financial institutions. And those financial institutions at the same time are receiving an influx of capital through trading operations. So it is very important, again, that the state must also sponsor the activities of their own trading companies overseas to provide protection, to create navies, to escort them overseas, wherever they go, and trying to protect their territories whenever they go to war, again, to protect the company's interest as well overseas, etc. So this is, again, leading to the reason behind the effort of European powers to expand even more so to far-flung areas of the globe, sponsoring trading operations, you know, by their companies to secure wealth and resources from other societies in order to feed off, if you will, the state and the needs of the state to protect the integrity of their territories and also to perhaps even expand, not only within Europe, but overseas as well. So they're highly, highly organized now, again. And at the same time, since those state systems are trying to protect their own economic interest, they're trying to also implement certain policies, they're called protective policies, to protect their own economies from their rivals as well. This is what is called mercantilist policies. Mercantilist policies, again, are policies that restrict trade, in other words, that, look, our country must make sure that we limit the import of goods from other countries. We don't want to buy, in other words, products from our neighbors, from our rivals, because that will benefit them, in other words. That will be a transferring gold and silver to other state systems, in other words. So mercantilist policies limit the imports of goods, and they're trying to maximize exports at the same time, to protect the domestic economy, to protect the domestic companies, in other words, trying to make people buy, from their own domestic, companies. Again, so what this all entailed as a whole, this new kind of state system that is more centralized politically, economically, that have standing armies, national banks supporting the operations of those standing armies, trading companies that are being protected overseas and the like. What this entails is that the Europeans, as they're moving out of Europe precisely to enhance their incomes that their trading companies are bringing in by securing resources, gold, silver, cotton, sugar, etc., is that this is ensuring a steady supply of revenue for defense and war. Okay, for defense and war. So this is going to fuel the process of colonization. There's an incentive for colonizing different areas of the globe. And you're looking for those kinds of resources to defend your country, increase the number of troops, for example, navies, to finance overseas operations, trading companies, and the like, and defend your interest overseas when it comes to, for example, war. Again, so this really became part of a cycle, something, again, that started out very early on with the rise of the trading empires. One of the reasons why they were expanding was precisely that. They were trying to secure the resources in order to create and maintain large armies, in order to expand trade, in order to secure wealth, for that wealth to build a larger army. And again, the cycle continued for the army to expand and so on and so forth. Again, it is part of the same process, but Europe, again, is now reaching, of course, areas of the globe that will pretty much cover the entire planet. Okay, it's not just going to be limited to the Western Hemisphere. Okay, all right. So those are the three historical contingencies that explain the rise of the West. Okay. Now let's look at part two. And as I mentioned, part two is going to look at, first and foremost, the old colonialism. This is the kind of like the beginning stages, let us just say, for the rise of the West. Something that spanned between 1500 to 1750. We're going to see the rise of certain kinds of empires that will be distinct, let us just say, from the ones that will emerge in the new colonialism after 1750. The kind of empires we see on the rise very early on were empires that sustain their economies through the production of cash crops. So, what those empires were doing, for the most part, were really setting up a series of plantations, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, plantations that were really the major generators of wealth for the empire, cash crops that could be traded for gold and silver in the world market, something that had a demand worldwide. Okay, so the kind of empires we see on the rise were known as the plantation empires, and those were particularly in Europe, Spain, Portugal, France, Great Britain, for the most part. Again, those were the original plantation empires that will dominate this stage of old colonialism. So let us look at this so-called old colonialism. And we're going to see quite briefly in part two the plantation empires and also the kind of cash crops that they produce. But at the same time, we're going to see the effects of those empires in world history. Okay. All right. So, as I mentioned, the discovery of America by Europeans, and initially, again, Spain is claiming the credit of the discovery of America, which Christopher Columbus, of course, accomplished in 1492. But the significance, and I stress this over again, is that the discovery of America provided a new commercial opportunity for Europe, an opportunity that was really lacking and absent. And this is something that Europeans were growing more and more desperate for in the absence of land. Okay. They were importing spices from the Far East and silk, for instance. With the Portuguese trade, they were importing also ivory, textiles, including gold and so on. So the Europeans were desperate to produce something for the world market in order to gain a competitive advantage over all the other trading partners. They had a trading balance, and again, the discovery of America kind of solved that. So, as we'll see, initially what the Europeans were trying to do, starting with the Portuguese and the Spanish, even within the confines of Europe, was to grow sugar. Sugar was largely dominated by the Arab world. They had begun to, the sugar industry, the Arabs, around the 700s AD, when they moved into India, the native region of sugarcane. They exported the sugarcane and they started growing it in the Middle East, parts of North Africa, parts of the Eastern Mediterranean world, and so on. And they were the main suppliers of sugar to not only the Middle East markets, but also to Europe as well. It was very expensive commodity. Okay, so they were the forerunners of the sugar plantation, the Arabs. And also, they were the forerunners of the slave trade as well in Africa, the export slave trade, the Arabs. So the Europeans were attempting to move into that territory, but they just didn't have the land again. So the discovery of America provided a new opportunity to engage in what is called cash crop agriculture, to grow not only sugar for the European market, but also for the world market. Why not? I mean, there will be more than enough land, again, in America to do so. And as we'll see, when the Europeans arrived, they also uh, encountered other commodities that found a market in Europe and around the world. Those were actually crops or plants that were native, indigenous to the American continent, like tobacco, for example. And so tobacco will become as well a major commodity to be traded in the world market, something that was grown by the natives for hundreds and hundreds of years. And when the Europeans arrived, they learned about tobacco and they're going to commercialize it. They're also going to commercialize cotton agriculture as they're going to be moving into the New World. For textile manufacturing, something we covered previously, they're going to be growing also rice and also coffee, something that, a bean that was domesticated in East Africa, what today is called the country of Ethiopia, for example, and really was becoming coffee beans was really becoming a high price commodity also in the world market at this time. And again, the Europeans will also grow it in the New World. So as they're beginning to arrive to America and establish a series of colonies, many of those colonies will be totally geared towards the production of cash crops. That really was the purpose of establishing a colony again in a mercantile system. The purpose of colonization was not totally centered on simply sending people over to settle and trying to relieve the demographic pressure, for example, in Europe. That was part of the story. And you find more land, okay, you can relieve populations, of course. But from a mercantilist point of view, the colonies must serve an economic function to the mother country. And that is that the colonies must produce the wealth for the mother country. They must produce the cash crops, they must produce minerals, resources, and in other words, enhance the wealth of the mother country. And during this period of time, from 1500 to 1750, the wealth that European powers are accumulating from their American colonies are based on agricultural products, cash crops. The ones are listed here in the outline. So the kind of economic systems that those empires are building are agricultural economies. They're still, again, largely based on that. But this is not the kind of agricultural system that we saw, for example, in the pre-modern era, in which people were simply, or state systems, rulers were simply extracting crops, harvest from their peasant populations. They will continue to do so, by the way. This is not going to be eliminated. But now the wealth of the empire is coming from the cash crops that the colonies produce on the other side of the Atlantic. So again, those are agricultural economies and agricultural empires. And as a matter of fact, they're labeled as plantation empires. Plantation empires. Now, having said that, please keep in mind that the plantation itself is an, an economic unit that can be explained in two ways. It has two sides, in other words. You can see it either way, but again, they're part of the same complex. A plantation, it is really, on the one hand, is really an agricultural enterprise by which people are growing exotic plants. This is why it's called plantation. Again, this is very different from a farm. In a farm, the difference is that people are growing food that is essential for survival. Grains, for example. What you grow in a farm is vegetables, grains like wheat or corn, beans, potatoes, etc. Again, that sustain a family or sustain a community. So farms, again, are different from plantations in that people are growing essential foodstuffs that are consumed locally or regionally. Okay? A plantation is a mercantile enterprise in which people are not necessarily growing an essential item, with very few exceptions. When you would talk, for example, about rice, that would be the only exception. For the most part, people are growing an exotic plant that is not necessarily necessary for human survival. It is a luxury item. It's called a commodity. It's something that we don't really need, but it's something that brings significant pleasure and fulfillment to people. Like coffee, for example. We don't need coffee to survive, but again, we find coffee to be pleasant and give us, energy and so on. The same with sugar. We just don't need, sugar to survive. Again, this is something that we consume out of just sheer pleasure for our personal, happiness, for example. Okay. Tobacco, the same way. Again, this is something that people smoke in order to relieve anxiety, depression, etc. For social purposes, for socializing, and the like. Cotton, once again, is for textile manufacturing and the like. So those are really tropical, exotic plants that are not even consumed locally. It's a mercantile enterprise in which all the product leaves into the global network is for export. So this is an export-oriented enterprise. Okay, the plantation itself. So this is something that we must understand, rather well here, is that one way to understand this is that this is a mercantile export-led enterprise. Okay. The other side of the plantation as a unit, as a complex, is that it is also a labor system. Okay, because the workforce that is growing, the coffee, the rice, the tobacco, the sugar, cotton, etc., is made up of slaves. So it's also a slave labor system. Okay. Why this is important is because the plantation empires that we're going to look at quite briefly here in this section were empires that were generating, of course, significant revenues from their colonies because they had available land on the one hand, but at the same time, they had a reliable labor force that was providing all the energy, the time, the effort, the labor, in other words, to produce those very valuable cash crops that were traded for gold and silver. And again, this was a very cost-effective type of operation in which, again, they're pretty much saving a great deal of money on labor. I mean, let us be clear, of course, the price of slaves were quite elevated. So this is not to say that they were acquiring the slaves for free by any means, by any stretch of the imagination. But once that investment was made, the dividends, the revenues that you will extract from that original investment will outstrip many times what they invested in acquiring or purchasing the slave. Okay, so this was a very profitable, very lucrative type of operation, the plantation itself. So let us look at the plantation empires that form part of this old colonialism. We're going to see the regions that they colonized and established their agricultural colonies, establish a series of plantations, looking at also the kind of crops that we're growing and how this is going to lead to the rise of the West, initially starting with Spain. Even before the discovery of America in 1492, which was sponsored by Spain, Columbus's journey was sponsored by the Spanish monarchs. Even just before, years before, Spain was already trying to move into the sugar industry because it was highly profitable. I mean, it's something that the Arabs control in the Middle East, sugar production. So what we see is starting with the Spanish and trying to acquire lands that were lacking in Europe, and they were beginning to expand out of the Iberian Peninsula, and they moved into a series of islands off the northwest coast of Africa. Those islands are labeled as the Canary Islands, and the Spanish moved into the series of islands and claim entitlements to them, colonize them, and transform those islands into sugar producing colonies starting around 1479. As you can see in this map again of the northwest coast of Africa, we see a series of islands that are beginning to be colonized by Europeans for the sole purpose of producing sugar to the world. So again, they're really establishing a series of sugar plantations in the region and transform each one of those islands into a gigantic sugar plantation. Okay. So again, this is really begin this process of colonization, starting with the Canary Islands. Now, with the discovery of America in 1492, the Spaniards, which claim entitlements to the discovery, to the lands that they had just discovered, they will be the forerunners of colonization of the New World. And the first region that they colonized was the Caribbean basin. Virtually every island of the Caribbean, whether we're talking about Hispaniola, for example, Puerto Rico, or Cuba, the Bahamas, for example, Barbados, etc. There's a series of islands, as you can see here. Each one of them was colonized by Spain, and they were transformed, just like the Canary Islands, into plantation colonies to grow mainly sugar, but also tobacco, because, as I said, this is a plant that was discovered also by the Europeans. And when they returned back to Spain, they took samples of the tobacco leaves and so on. Europeans almost immediately develop a fondness to smoking tobacco for various reasons. Again, this is a plant that was smoked in the Americas by the natives for ceremonial purposes. This was considered a sacred plant, by the way. I mean, this is something that you must understand, is that the natives did not grow tobacco for entertainment purposes, for recreational purposes, but rather for ritualistic, ceremonial, medicinal purposes. Every time the chiefs gathered, for example, during a full moon, they will smoke the tobacco in order to enhance wisdom. They believed in that. Healers will smudge the body of a patient in order to detect disease areas, and they will use smudging uh, rituals, smudging the body of the patient with the smoke of the tobacco in order to cleanse it from, again, evil spirits and the like. Okay, so it was ceremonial plant. Again, it found a market in Europe, and also when the Europeans moved into Africa, the peoples of Africa also developed a certain fondness to tobacco, and it is very, very important to note that in Africa, people also discovered certain medicinal, spiritual, mystical qualities to tobacco, as opposed to the kind of social and recreational types of uses that Europeans developed. Okay, so again, there is a growing market for tobacco, and this is something that the Europeans, starting with the Spanish, are beginning to grow in greater quantities. They're commercializing those plants. I mean, this is not the kind of vision that the Native Americans actually endorsed. No, the kind of commercialization of a sacred plant, again, to be grown just mindlessly again. But again, this is something that is taking place nonetheless because there's a market. Again, we're moving into a market-oriented world, and this is really transforming human societies. And human cultures are also changing as well. The values are changing. What people see, for example, in tobacco, again, is really changing around the world. So each one of those colonies, at least across the 1500s, is possessed by Spain, and Spain is, again, pretty much engaged in the massive production of those crops. Now, Portugal will be another European empire that is also moving forward, expanding, and trying to seize territories outside of Europe for the purpose of developing plantation systems for the production of cash crops, just like, for example, Spain was moving into the Canary Islands. The Portuguese, when they were exploring West Africa, they also seized an island called the Madeira Island in 1425. Similarly, this is an island that is off the northwest coast of Africa. And they're going to transform this island into a sugar producing island for the Portuguese emerging empire. At this point, Portugal cannot be really termed as an empire. Not until, of course, America is discovered and the Portuguese, after the Spaniards, are exploring areas that are not yet explored by Spain, particularly South America, and they're beginning to claim large territories of South America and build their own colonial territories they're going to call Brazil, something that starts, roughly speaking, around 1500. And likewise, Brazil, which stood in the eastern seaboard of South America, was turned into this massive, gigantic sugar plantation network. It's a sugar producing colony for the Portuguese Empire. But at the same time, the Portuguese found gold as well. So they're also developing gold mines. And this is going to lead to the massive territorial expansion of Brazil, because that entailed more and more labor. And of course, we're talking about slave labor being used in order to cut the forest, make more room for farms, for cattle ranching to sustain the colonial population, and also to be engaged in the extraction of gold as well. So again, the rise of the Portuguese Empire was largely due to sugar on one hand, but also gold. Again, this is something that the Spaniards also enjoyed as well, something we talked about in the past as well, when the Spaniards found significant amounts of gold in the New World, particularly Mexico. And large deposits of silver were found also in Mexico and in South America. France is another plantation empire that we're going to see in the rise, particularly as we're moving into the 1600s. Now, the French, something we talked about in the past with the rise of the trading empires, they begin their rise in the 1500s when they establish a trading company in North America, the Royal Company of New France. It was a fur trading company. We talked about that for the fur trade. Over time, as we're moving into the 1600s, the French are moving also into the sugar industry as well in their own right. And by this time, they're clipping off colonies from Spain, particularly islands in the Caribbean basin, are being transferred to France for the purpose of growing sugar. So this is, again, the moment when in 1697, the French take control of an island. It was originally, of course, Hispaniola, that is being renamed as Santo Domingo or Saint Domingue. And also, this is an island that will be labeled as the island of Haiti. Okay, the island of Haiti. They're growing sugar, they're growing coffee, they're growing cotton for the French Empire. Again, and this is going to really lead to the rise of the French Empire, more so than in the past, in that there's no denying that the fur trade gave the French enough wealth to start really building an empire that was also moving into the Far East with their own East India Company. We looked at that as well, establishing trading outposts in India. But the Western Hemisphere is providing a new opportunity. And again, sugar by this time is worth gold. As a matter of fact, again, this is really termed white gold, something we covered already in the past. So they're growing sugar there, and also they're establishing also another international port in North America in the Gulf of Mexico. They're going to call this international port New Orleans, and New Orleans was just a gigantic network of sugar plantations as well. The French established starting around 1718. They're producing sugar and they're exporting the sugar to the world market. Again, something that France was selling within Europe, but also this is sugar that was being sold also to the British colonists as well of North America. Okay, so again, this is really giving rise to those empires that we just mentioned a few moments ago, the agricultural plantation empires. Great Britain is also going to be participating in this kind of imperial venture that starts out as a series of plantations scattered in North America. Some of them will be established also in the Caribbean, as we'll see. But very early on, in 1607, 1609, British merchants create a series of companies that were geared precisely to produce cash crops for the British Empire. Some of them, of course, was the Virginia Stock Company. Almost from the get-go, this company started growing tobacco for the British. So it became a tobacco company. Okay. This is part of this process by which the emergent European empires are trying to develop agricultural companies, in other words. It was really agricultural companies. They sent people over, the stockholders uh, were sent to Virginia to start the plantation. So the plantation uh, owners, or the planter class in this case, which were really members of the British nobility, they were at the same time stockholders of the company. They were given land grants to grow tobacco, and they brought initially indentured servants from Britain to grow the tobacco, and eventually they shifted to African slavery. Okay. Now, in 1670, we see the creation of another colony called Carolina that was also founded by a series of planters, sugar barons from Barbados. They were led by Anthony Ashton Cooper, for example. Him, along a series of sugar planters from Barbados, were given a charter to start another operation for the British Empire in North America to grow things like rice, indigo, and also sugar for the British Empire. As you can see here, again, those are the lower colonies, or the southern colonies that they were called. Okay. Eventually, the British also seized territories from Spain in the 1600s, and a couple of Caribbean islands like Jamaica and Barbados, for example. As you can see, Jamaica is right here. Okay. And Barbados is a tiny island for the British to start growing sugar as well for the British Empire. And again, this is going to be really the key to the success for the rise of the British Empire. It is not until they entered the sugar trade, when they seized control of Jamaica and Barbados, that we're going to see the rise of the British. Something we covered actually in the last topic when we were looking at the British Industrial Revolution. How sugar actually financed British industrialization. So again, this is the early stages of colonialism that the Europeans were engaged in, and it was mainly agricultural ventures, establishing plantations in the New World, and there were not only hundreds. Eventually, the empires that we just covered were able to establish thousands of plantations scattered, across the New World. And this is where the wealth, again, of the Portuguese, Spanish, French, British empires, came from. Now, this old form of colonialism is going to have profound effects in the world at large. And I would like to spend some time here really discussing some of those effects. For example, number one, this is something that we covered already, but I'm just here to kind of, stress it once again. It is the devastation of indigenous populations. First, from epidemics, the decimation of Native American populations through epidemics, of course, smallpox, but also initially when the Europeans arrived, they demanded tribute from the natives to work in the tobacco plantations, growing tobacco, but also sugar plantations, and that also decimated populations as well. So it had an effect, again, on the colonial population. Just the island of Hispaniola, as I said before, which had about 500,000 people in 1492, by 1520, again, it went to zero, literally, again, because of the epidemics and the tribute that the Spaniards demanded in terms of providing gold and labor, and working in plantations and the like. It also brought about radical environmental change as well. For example, the regions that were colonized by the Europeans to make room for plantations were deforested. So we see massive deforestation in those areas, particularly even, again, the Canary Islands, the Madeira Island of the west coast of North Africa were totally, again, the rainforest was totally cut down to make room for plantations, for example, or the Caribbean islands, or in Brazil, in South America, we see the gigantic, forest there in South America. Part of that was decimated to make room for agricultural production, cattle ranching, mining, etc., plantations, and the like. So again, we see massive deforestation, and with that, of course, we see the loss of, the uh, flora and fauna that was part of the ecosystem of the region. Animals that live off, again, vegetation or insects, or live off of other animals that kept a certain balance within the ecosystem, again, was lost. So this is going to set off a certain uh, ecological imbalance. Again, we also see the loss of medicinal plants as well, plants that the natives had been using for hundreds and hundreds of years to treat certain illnesses and the like. Again, all of that was decimated as well. And of course, soil erosion. With intensive agriculture, by growing cash crops continuously year by year, you also decimate the quality of the soil and you start eroding it as well, because you're really rendering those areas quite barren at the same time. So it had an environmental impact. Now, there's also, of course, a certain kind of impact in society. We see the reformulation of colonial societies in the New World. Again, so what we see is the formation of new kinds of societies in which people are going to be, on one hand, identified in a new way, and they're going to be stacked one upon another. Again, those groups, those social categories, those social identities are going to be stacked like in a pyramid, in a kind of hierarchy, that made it or facilitated the empires that were 3,000 miles away back in Europe, facilitated them the control of those populations. Keep in mind that those are empires trying to govern colonies that are so far away, colonies that are made up of very diverse populations. Okay, the Americas really is really a kind of a social laboratory, a motley of peoples, in that there were a wide array of different groups. Some of them were part of the Native American, of course, world. And even within the Native American world, there's great diversity within them. There are European immigrants arriving, Spaniards, Portuguese, French, British, etc. And of course, they're bringing also slaves from Africa as well. And even within Africa, there's also great diversity as well. This is not to say that, just because somebody's coming from Africa, they're all the same. There are significant differences, linguistic, cultural differences, religious differences, tribal, etc. Again, differences as well. So they're quite diverse populations. Okay. And as we'll see, those empires, in their attempt to control those populations overseas, they're going to develop social control mechanisms by which they're going to separate people along certain artificial categories that today we call race. People will be identified as belonging to a certain racial group. And I repeat, this is an artificial construct that has no basis in biology. Again, there are no races of peoples. Again, there's only one race, and that is the human race. We're part of Homo sapiens, that is to say. The differences in physical characteristics, etc., are due to the exposure with the environment, environmental adaptation. We mutate according to diet, temperatures and heat and so on, type of soil and the like. That creates differences and diversity. But again, those differences are totally created by the environment, but ultimately we're part of the same race. But as we'll see, those empires that were trying to rule society so far away try to control people by separating them. Labeling them as races, like the Native Americans were considered, part of one race of people. The Europeans were a different race of people. The African slaves were considered part of a different racial group. Again, so this is really something that is arising, of course, out of the need to control populations, but at the same time, trying to understand diversity. In other words, the European empires were also trying to understand why people are so diverse, why we find so much diversity within the human family. In other words, why people look so different, why the natives look different from Europeans, from Africans, from Asians, from Middle Easterns, and so on. Why? And this is something that starts with the Spanish Empire in the 1500s. They're the forerunners of colonization. They're the first ones to encounter the Native Americans. And one of the issues leading the Spaniards to really find the answer to this question, why there's so much diversity, is, well, why is it that the Native Americans are not mentioned in the Christian Bible? We're trying to understand who are the natives, where they come from, if they're actually human. As a matter of fact, they had a great debate in Spain in the 1500s. It was called the Great Debate. Scholars, religious scholars, and so on, intellectuals, philosophers engaged in universities in a great debate, trying to debate whether the natives were even human, in other words, because the Christian Bible doesn't mention them. Okay, so if they're not mentioned in the Bible, well, maybe they constitute a separate kind of people, in other words. Maybe they're not human, maybe they don't have a soul, okay? So maybe it's not really worth saving them, because ultimately this is what the Spaniards wanted to do: send missionaries to the New World in order to save the souls of the natives, in other words, to convert them to Christianity. So as this debate rages on, again, this is a debate between two great scholars, Bartolomé de las Casas, a friar who was the great defender of the natives, who complained endlessly about the mistreatment of the Native Americans, and said, this is not what Christians should be doing. In other words, we need to treat, more the natives more humanely, and so on. He was debating another scholar, Juan Guinés de Sepúlveda, who claimed that the natives were not even human. And so those were just creatures that were soulless. So it was okay to exploit them, because ultimately, again, they did not belong to the human family. Luckily, Bartolomé de las Casas ended up winning the debate, and it was determined by the Spanish authorities that indeed, again, the natives had a soul, but that because they were not mentioned in the Bible, that the natives belong to a different kind of human race. Okay, they're not mentioned in the Bible, so there's no historical basis for them. So the only answer as to who are they, where they come from, is they must constitute a separate kind of humanity. In other words, a different kind of human. In other words, a human race. Okay, so that was part of the issue. Another part of the issue that was leading the Spanish Empire to formulate the concept of race is the problem of colonial rebellions. Now, there was a series of colonial rebellions that not only the Spaniards faced, but also other empires faced. Like, for example, the slave revolt in Santo Domingo, for example, in 1521. Okay, there are rebellions against the Spanish authorities. Also in Mexico, there's a tribal group known as the Chichimec. In 1550 all the way to 1590, they were at war against the Spanish conquistadors, trying to expel the Spanish institutions and so on in the New World. And again, they're facing now revolution from below, whether they're slaves or Native Americans. And the British in Virginia in 1675, they also faced a rebellion. It's called Bacon's Rebellion. Again, this was a rebellion that was actually led by indentured servants that were both European and also African, and they were led by a planter, Nathaniel Bacon. Again, they were really trying to remove the authorities of Virginia. It's a massive, destructive rebellion. From below, once again, in that we see alliances between different groups, African slaves with poor European immigrants, and also some planters as well. We also see, of course, a massive slave revolt in Carolina in 1739, became known as the Stono Slave Rebellion. It was also quite destructive. It was led by slaves as well, trying to liberate slaves along the Stono River and the like against the British, of course, planters there in the region. So, as the Europeans are facing rebellions in their colonies from below, from, again, the diverse populations that they had, natives, African slaves, sometimes even the wealthy planters participate on the side of the poor, and so on, they deemed necessary to devise a system of control. In other words, to try to control population. And the system implied dividing the colonists along racial categories or castes. Now, we have run out of time at this point, but when we'll come back, we're going to pick up from here, trying to develop again the discussion of the caste system, how we see colonial societies in which people are labeled uh, uh, certain racial categories or identification, racial identities again, and how this is going to be moving world history in a very, very unique, very different direction. Okay, so this is all I have for you. I'll see you then in session 2. We're going to continue looking at uh, the end of the old colonialism, and we're going to be moving now into the new colonialism, the rise of the industrial empires when we come back. Thank you.